Okay, let's get started. So welcome to the webinar. My name is Moonsop Lee. I'm an assistant professor at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UC San Diego. So this webinar is jointly organized by UC San Diego and Seoul National University, and we truly appreciate the generous support from the Korea Foundation. So this meeting will be recorded and posted after the event at our Korea Pacific Program webpage, gps.ucsc.edu/kpp. Before introducing the today's speaker, I will introduce two upcoming webinars, one in April and one in May, very quickly. We will have Heino Klink, the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. So with him, we will have very interesting conversation about very relevant topic these days, the Korea and the Indo-Pacific strategy. So that is going to be 4 p.m. next Monday in Seoul time. That is going to be 8 a.m. in the morning on Tuesday. In May, so we will have Professor Chul-hee Lee. He's going to discuss about the sectoral shift, the technological change, and old labor, evidence from the US and South Korea. So he will do the comparison between the US history from the 1880 to 1940, 60 years, to the Korea's experience from the 1960 to 2020. So that will be interesting to the audiences coming from both Korea and the US. So that is going to be 5 p.m. On May 10th, Monday, and in Seoul, that is going to be 9 a.m. like today on Tuesday. So to register for the future webinars, please visit us at the Korea Pacific Program webpage. Okay, so today I'm very excited to introduce the speaker, the Professor Jisoo Hwang. So Jisoo Hwang is an associate professor of economics at the College of Liberal Studies, Seoul National University. She is an applied microeconomist with a special research interest in labor and family economics. She received the bachelor degree in economics at the Seoul National University and her PhD in economics at Harvard University. So Jisoo will talk about the women, work, and family in South Korea. So during her about 30 minutes presentation, so please leave your question at the Q&A box below. So we will have an active conversation with her after her presentation. So I will read the question for you. So again, if you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to leave that on the Q&A box below. Okay, so then without the further ado, so Jisoo, take it away.
Thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for joining the talk. I'm Jisoo Hwang, and I'll talk about women, work, family in South Korea. So there has been many important social and economic changes during the past century, but perhaps one of the grandest advance was the rise in women's status in the economy. So a century ago, few women were college educated, few women had paid jobs, but in developed countries today, women are as educated as men and women are in various professions. But in the past decade or so, there has been a concern that this so-called gender revolution has stalled because in developed countries, the gender pay gap is not significantly narrowing down any further. And we still hear about glass ceilings in the most prestigious and high-paying occupations. And working women talk about, the second shift, when they come home from work, they have housework and childcare to take care of. So it's like having a second shift at home. So in the media and in academia, you hear about, that even in developed countries, women still can't have it all. And there has been a lot of research trying to explain why it seems to be so difficult to close down this last chapter, the remaining gender gap in labor outcomes. And traditionally, the more popular, I guess, explanations were that there are still, gender differences in human capital accumulation. That even if women are as educated as men, there are still differences when it comes to work experience, for example. And of course, there can still be, taste-based or not, there can still be some gender discrimination in the labor market. More recently, there has been evidence that there may be even gender differences in psychological attributes that result in this kind of remaining gender gap. For example, men and women behave differently in competitive settings, so that it may be at a disadvantage for women when you need to negotiate for higher pay, push for promotion, etc. And also there is a growing attention on the role of the role that social norms play, when it comes to, how a man or a woman, the gender roles, the norms regarding the gender roles, that could be a barrier to, further convergence in the roles of men and women in the economy. And talking about this change in women's status, change in women's role, I think South Korea is a very interesting case to study, not only because I'm from Korea, but because, as many of you know, Korea has experienced one of the most rapid, dramatic changes over the past century. So it was, one of the world's it was a very poor Asian country, but experienced one of the world's fastest growing economy from the 1960s to the 1990s, so that in just a few generations, South Korea transformed from a developing country to a developed country. And just to give you an example of how rapid that pace was, this figure shows the percent of women aged 25 to 34 with, some call it, with tertiary education, so any education above high school, in South Korea and the US from 1995 to 2020. And you see that, compared to the US, where the increase in the fraction of women with college education has been, it is impressive, but still gradual compared to that in Korea, where you see that in 1995, only about 20% of young women had tertiary education, but has increased by 53 percentage points in just 25 years. So we're talking about extraordinary change arising in South Korea. And the question that I want to address today in this talk is South Korea like a fast forward version of the rise in women's status? And what I mean by that is South Korea going in the same direction as in other developed countries like the US and developed countries in Europe, but just everything happening in a much condensed period? So instead of a century, just 25 years. Or does the speed itself, the speed of change, does that affect the evolution of women's work and family? Meaning, is the fact that Korea changes so quickly, could that lead Korea down a different path, a different equilibrium of women's work and family compared to other developed countries, which has developed at a much gradual pace compared to Korea? So to address this question, instead of going into details of one specific paper, I want to give you a bigger picture, I guess, of what's going on in Korea. So I've put together some main findings, main takeaways from 5 of my research in this area. So including some of my published work and also my most recent working paper. So today I'll be showing you a bunch of figures from these different papers. The data that I'll be using, so when I try to compare Korea and US, I'll be using data from the OECD and World Bank. When I show you statistics from within Korea, I'll be using national statistics like vital statistics, the population data, census, and the economically active population survey. So let me start with this figure to kind of show you that Korea may not be a simple fast forward version of the US or other European developed countries. So this is again female labor force participation rate, but this time by age group in 2019. So this is the most recent cross-section data in South Korea and the US. And if you look at the green line, which is the US, if you look at that for a second, it has this hump-shaped profile, which is very common across developed countries, and it's common for both men and women. You see that more people start to work as they finish college, so it starts to increase in age 20s, and then it's pretty flat during the prime working age period, and then it starts to fall as some women start to retire. So in both men and women, and in most developed countries, you see this nice hump-shaped profile when it comes to labor force participation by age. But in Korea, you see that it's not hump-shaped, and we call this an M-shaped profile because you have this noticeable drop in the 30s when women are in their 30s. And because I just told you about how Korea changed so rapidly, I'm going to show you how this then changed across cohorts. So let me plot this by cohort. So this is the same figure, but Korean woman born in the 1960s. So you see that there is that M, and the drop is when the women are around age 25. And then if I move across cohorts, so this is the 1970s cohort now, you see that the M kind of shifts to the right, and the drop now occurs at early 30s for women. And now this is the most recent cohort that I can get data with. And you see that with each successive cohort, the drop occurs at older ages, and the profile kind of moves to the right. And it has gotten a bit flatter, I guess, but it just doesn't disappear, right? The M shape doesn't disappear, and it's not close to the hump shape that I showed you earlier in the US. And why is there this drop? Why does Korea have this drop in female labor force participation rate when women are in their 20s or 30s? There's no secret to that. It's the time when women get married and have children. Some women drop out of the labor force altogether. So how can we put this in, how should we understand this in an economic framework? Well, if you just think about a simple model where individuals try to maximize utility with regards to consumption and household production. So household production here just encompasses everything from your utility from your children, the companionship from your spouse, and all the household produced goods. And trying to maximize this utility, individuals make decisions with regards to how much education to receive, how much to invest in their human capital, whether to get married, whether to have children, how many children to have, etc. And of course, when it comes to education or human capital investment, you make an investment only if the benefit is larger than the cost, right? You go to college, you go to grad school in the hopes of getting that return in the labor market, whether that's a better job or higher lifetime earnings, right? You invest in your human capital expecting that return. Similarly, when it comes to marriage, you choose to marry only if the utility when you're married is expected to be larger than the utility when you're single. And also children, you have children only if the benefit of having children is larger than the cost. So, given this simple framework, if the environment, however, is such that it's difficult for women to pursue career and family, then women may choose to either not marry or have children or invest less in their human capital. Because being rational and forward-looking, if women know in advance that once they marry and have children, they would have to either quit, drop out of the labor force, or cut back on their career at least, then they're faced with this trade-off now. Should I keep my career and pursue my career, in which case then I may have to give up having children? Or if I'm going to have children, then why should I invest so much in my career and education now, right? Why work so hard to become a successful lawyer if once I have children, I'll probably have to cut back on my hours? So the thing is, if the environment is such that it's difficult for a woman to pursue career and family, then you come to this career or family trade-off. For the woman's rational choice would be either or, right? You choose either or. But why does it have to be so difficult, right? Why is it then difficult for women to pursue career and family in South Korea? Obviously, it's difficult everywhere. It's difficult everywhere. And it's difficult for men and women. But why is this trade-off so binding for women in Korea, so that you even see that M shape in the labor force participation profile? Why does this trade-off seem to be so binding for women in Korea? And here's where my take comes in. So my one explanation for this is that it's related to the fact that Korea changed so quickly. So, I showed you one example with education, but when it comes to education, labor market opportunities, Korea changed rapidly in just, 3 generations. But the problem is social norms cannot. And social norms, there's intergenerational transmission of social norms. What that means is, your norms about gender roles, etc., they're transmitted, passed on from parents to children. So even my cohort, or 1980s cohort, which have this incredible numbers of educated men and women, and incredible opportunities in the labor market, when it comes to household, most of us grew up in rather traditional households with male breadwinner and female caregiver. And that has been the model in Korea just until like a generation ago. So what happens is when people marry, when they form families, the gender roles that kick in are actually from your own experience and from the norms around you. Women still expect themselves, and other people also expect women to be responsible for housework and childcare. And when I talk about childcare in Korea, it's pretty intensive mothering, so it takes a lot of time and effort. And same thing for men. So when it comes to workplace culture, this male breadwinner, female caregiver household model has been so valid just until a few decades ago, so that the workplace culture is also very unsupportive of workers' family responsibilities. So we have very long working hours, or people appreciate having long working hours, and it's difficult to balance that with family responsibilities. And the thing is, that's because just until a few decades ago, most of these workers had their wives take care of housework and childcare, so it was never really necessary to have a family-friendly environment in the workplace. So as a result, what happens in Korea is that you have this great discrepancy between women's role or potential in the workforce and the woman's role, or what's expected from women in the household. And this discrepancy is much greater than in other developed countries, at least in the West, because, as I said, those European or in the US, these kind of economic changes occurred much gradually at a slower pace. So in some sense, social norms had the time to kind of keep up with that. But in Korea, everything happened in like 2 generations. So there's this gap between women's role in the so-called public sphere and women's role in the private sphere can be much wider in that sense. Or in other words, women's role in the household is like lagging behind a generation compared to that in women's role in the workforce. And then, faced with this conflicting roles, women, particularly the well-educated, who would have a higher opportunity cost of giving up on their career, will increasingly forego family. Going back to that economic model, it would be rational for them to then give up family, because they know that they're able to earn their own living, and they're able to achieve some sort of high level of utility, even if they don't have children, if they choose the career path. And one figure, I think, to show you this aspect is this picture, which shows you the fraction ever married among men and women in their late 30s by education level in Korea and the US. So look at the green line first. That's the US and also many other European countries. You see that the more educated you are, the more likely you are to be married. And that's the same for men and women. However, in Korea, men, you see the same pattern, but for women, you see the opposite pattern, where the more educated you are, the less likely you are to be married. And this is the family or career trade-off that I'm trying to talk about. And this has been going on for now, several years now, so that Korea even has a term Goldmiss to refer to these highly educated, never married career women. So there are there's a substantial fraction of very highly educated women who don't form families, who don't get married, and who don't have children. This figure is actually taken from my 2016 paper, which used data in 2010. So I recently updated this for by birth year to show you the trend. So this is again the percentage showing you the opposite, the never married and childless percentage in the late age 30s. And the y-axis is the difference between the college graduates and the less than college graduates in Korea. So for men, you see that the numbers are all negative, meaning that college graduate men are less likely to be single, they're less likely to be childless when they're in their late 30s. For women, you see all the numbers are positive again. So college graduate women are more likely to be single, they're more likely to be childless. And when you look at this by birth year, both never married and childless, the gap is not narrowing down. If anything, it's kind of getting wider, larger when you go to the more recent cohort, of 1980s cohort. There's still a 7 percentage point gap between college graduate women and less than college graduate women. So with this, it's not then surprising that with more and more women getting a higher education and more women going into more careers, but good professions, you're now going to observe in Korea a surge in the percentage of women never married or childless. So here, again, the x-axis is birth year, the y-axis, the percentage of women never married or childless at age 35. And you see that until women born in the 1960s, so that's like my parents' generation, Korea was one of those near universal marriage childbirth countries. So almost everyone got married, almost everyone had at least one child. From women born in the 1970s, you now start to see a departure from that. So you see more women never married, more women having no children. And it almost increases linearly after that, right? And so in the 1980s cohort, more than 1/3 of women are childless at age 35, and more than 1/4 of women age 35 are never married. And these are very high statistics. I mean, think about the US, for example. In the most recent year, the US, both numbers were about 20%. 20%. So in Korea, you're seeing larger numbers of women not forming families, either when it comes to marriage or whether you talk about fertility. And another thing that I want to point out from this figure is this widening gap between the two, which is also interesting. In Korea, it used to be that marriage and childbirth were almost equivalent. Like marriage was a precursor of childbirth. So if you get married, you have children. But now you see a break in that as well. You see that even some married women are saying, they're choosing not to have children. So you're seeing more of these childless married couples in Korea, which is a new phenomenon. And this gap here, I think, is also an interesting a fact to note, that Korea is really moving away from once those universal marriage and childbirth society to a society where more people are not getting married, more people are not having children. Even the married women are not some of the married women are not having children. So this, this is kind of, I guess, in more extreme, the extensive margin, am I going to get married? Am I going to have any children? But I can show you similar trends in the intensive margin as well, of how many children to have and when to have children. So this is fertility in Korea among women born in the 1960s. So the figure on the left is the age-specific fertility rate, and the figure on the right is the cumulative version of that, the cumulative core fertility. So you see that in women born in the 1960s, most of them had children when they were around age 25. And when you stack this up, you see that by the time that they're on the end of their reproductive age, they have around 2 children. Moving to the 1970 cohort, you see that the distribution shifts substantially to the right as more women start to have children in their 30s and they're not their 20s. But an important thing to note here is that it's not just the shift to the right, but also that the cumulative cohort fertility has dropped significantly. So it's not just that women are delaying childbirth. It's not just a tempo effect here. There's a significant quantum effect where in that there's not enough recuperation at older ages. It's not that women are having two kids, not in their 20s, but in their 30s. Women are just not having two kids anymore. In the 1970s cohort, you see that it's about 1.5 children by the time they're age 40. And for the most recent cohort, they're not old enough to be past 40, but you see that even if I draw this curve until age 50, it's not going to go near the previous cohort. You see that there's again a significant drop in the actual number of children that women are having. And this number here is about 1.29. So we're having less than 1.3 children, women in the 1980s cohort. So when you use this age-specific fertility rates to calculate the total fertility rate, you have this figure here where, so the green line is the US, and this is now calendar year. And the US, you see a decline, and then as you see the fertility rate hovering around the replacement level, about 2.1 children per woman, and then it's a bit lower than that. In Korea, you see this plunge from women they used to have about 5 to 6 kids in 1960, but then it falls to around replacement level. And then there's a substantial decline even after that, right? So it's not like in the US or in many other European countries where the total fertility rate fell below replacement level for, a few years and then it comes back again. In Korea, you don't see any sign that there is going to be a reversal in the trend, that it's going to pick up again. It's actually falling more, such that in 2019, Korea's total fertility rate was 0.9 child per woman. That's so less than 1 child per woman, and that's the lowest among all countries in the world. So Korea is its low fertility is almost at a different level from other developed countries that talk about low fertility in Europe or in the US. So I think the main message that I wanted to get across is that this interaction between rapid economic growth and relatively slow-moving social norms seems to be leading South Korea down a different path from many other developed countries. So it's not just that everything is, Korea grew really quickly, so we will follow the same trend as the US or in other European countries in a few years. It seems like Korea is going to a different path where it's not like the more educated and the more economic growth you have, more women are able to have career and family, but it seems like more women are choosing or to forego family because they're faced with this career or family trade-off. And with these figures that I showed you, unfortunately, it seems like South Korea's low marriage and low fertility rates are not going to go away anytime soon. So it's not just a temporary phenomenon where women just delay marriage and delay childbirth, and then someday they're going to catch up. It's that more women are really not going to form families, they're not going to have children, even those who are married. And the thing that concerns me is that this then itself can have a reinforcing effect. It's that low fertility, once it's not temporary and once it really becomes a phenomenon like this that goes on for several years, young people's ideal family size can then be influenced by this actual family size. So there can be a feedback loop in the sense that when so many young men and women now observe people who are not married, who choose not to be married, or who only has 1 child maximum, that would affect their ideal family size, so that even when social norms do catch up, we may not be able to return to that 2 children per woman replacement level once people start to have this very small family as their ideal. So it's kind of like how in China, even when they got rid of the 1-child family policy, still people continue to have one child because that has now become like the ideal family size. So this kind of reinforcing effect can cause a country to be stuck in like a low fertility trap, meaning that Korea, if this goes on for long enough, and if that affects the young people's idea of how they want to live their life, then this can go on for even longer than what we expect. And then what can we do about this? Well, of course, by definition, it's difficult to suddenly change social norms, but so there has to be there has to be aggressive policies to narrow down this gap between women's role in the workforce and women's role in the household, or just to make it easier to balance career and family. But when you talk about these kind of policies, I think one difference that some people seem to have is that knowing these difficulties of working women, some people think then, oh, let's then make it easier by, for example, making maternity leave even longer so that working women can balance family and career. But I personally think that those kind of policies are going in the wrong direction, because once you make these family policies gendered in the sense that, make it easier for working women, that's also based on the assumption that the main caregiver is the woman, right? So if you make these gendered policies, it makes those gender norms, it doesn't go away. It actually strengthens the gender norm that mother or the woman is the one who has to take care of the child. So I think the direction should be, yeah, you need family policies, but it should be as gender neutral as possible, so that who takes care of the child, who works the long hours, the household decides, based on the husband's and the wife's comparative advantage and based on their constraints, they decide who will take the leave and who will work the longer hours. It shouldn't be that the workplace or the society is saying, mothers need this time, so let's make it easier for mothers. And that also would give more incentive for firms to discriminate against women. So there could be, all these repercussions from those gendered policies. So I think, when you talk about family-friendly policies, it's important, especially in Korea, to make them gender neutral, so that both men and women could, equally take part in the labor market and household duties as they see fit, based on their arrangement within the household. And if those policies are done right, then the good news is that they can help not only raise fertility rate, but also female labor force participation rate in Korea. Because in Korea, these are totally, they're interlinked. As I said, a lot of women are faced with a trade-off either or. So once you make it easier to balance the two, you can expect that both fertility rate and female labor force participation rate to rise, because you can make that M go away and to become like a hump shape like in other countries. And lastly, I want to mention that these findings, they don't just apply, they're just not relevant for the Korea in the near future, but also it has implications for other Asian countries which experienced rapid economic growth, like Singapore, Taiwan, and China, etc. And in fact, in China, I've seen many recent articles that they're also seeing the Chinese version of the Goldmiss phenomena. There are a lot of, you see the same phenomenon happening there as well. And I'm not surprised, right? It's China also went through rapid economic growth, but they also used to have rather traditional family norms. So then you'll again see this clash, or again see this discrepancy between the expected roles in the two spheres. And then a lot of women would then choose either or. And you could see similar demographic patterns arising there as well. So yeah, these are the slides that I've prepared, and I'm open for questions now. Thank you.
Thank you, Jisoo. So could you stop sharing your screen?
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you for very intriguing and inspiring talk presentation. So there are so many things to think about. So if you have any questions, please use the Q&A box below. Then I will collect the questions and deliver that to Jisoo. So we will have some informal conversation with Jisoo until 6 p.m. in San Diego time and 10 a.m. in Korea time. So the first of all, I will open the floor to the two panelists joining us today. So we have Professor Stefan Haggard from UC San Diego and Professor Jungmin Lee from Seoul National University. So if you have any questions, so please unmute yourself and then ask the question directly to Jisoo while I'm collecting the questions from audiences.
Sure. Oh, Jisoo, this was just absolutely fantastic, and we're so happy that you could join us. It's really a rich presentation. I have a question about that goes, I guess, a little bit to the theory and the modeling, because you set this up as, you know, a number of potential hypotheses about why wage gaps don't close, including human capital accumulation, psychology. But I want to focus on the difference between discrimination and norms, because I'm wondering if those can be differentiated as sharply as you suggest. So I guess my two questions are, first, how do you model this so you get to the conclusion that this is norms, or is that just a conclusion that's drawn from the pattern of the data and an interpretation that's put onto it? And how would you distinguish it from a discrimination story in which Korean women hit the workforce around their childbearing years? They don't see a path to equal advancement to men. It therefore becomes at the margin more attractive to simply go back into the household, so to speak, and they sort of give up on the workforce. And so this isn't just a normative story, it's about, in effect, discrimination against women of childbearing age. Something like, some kind of story like that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think it's important to make it clear that those the explanations that I lined up in the very first slide, that all of them probably apply to Korea, especially when it comes to the trend. There is definitely also, you know, differences in human capital. There is also, you know, differences, you know, discrimination, and there will also be psychological attributes. I'm sure it applies in Korea as well. I think I wanted to emphasize the norms part in this talk, because, you know, those things are, I think, pretty common across not just Korea but also in the U.S. But I think the norm story is what makes Korea or other developed countries maybe different from the other developed countries' trend. And I think one way to really, I think the clear evidence for that is the difference between college graduate women and the non-college graduate women. I think that's the example that will make it clear, because when you compare them, of course, college graduate women have higher human capital than less than college graduate women, but you see that the family, you know, patterns, it's like the opposite, right? The higher human capital women, they're the ones who are not getting married, who are not having children. So you definitely see that there's something working against these high educated career women. And in that sense, that's where the social norms kick in, right? Because psychological attributes, discrimination, those other explanations, they probably don't apply stronger to the college graduate woman than the less than college graduate women. And as to your second question of how do you distinguish between discrimination and social norms, I think partially I've answered that in the first part, but another thing is, yes, there's definitely as you said, I think there's definitely like a mix of that. Due to social norms, for example, at the workplace, because a lot of people still expect women to be responsible for childcare and housework, that could be the reason for discriminating against women who have children. They will assume that, oh, you're not going to be as committed to work as men because you have all these other family responsibilities. So I think norms could be a reason for some of the discrimination that's left in the workplace in Korea.
Yeah, it was that last mechanism you mentioned is exactly what I was trying to do.
Right,
yeah.
Right.
I have one quick comment. It was great presentation. My question is, so I think you're focusing on the trade-off high educated women are facing. But I would like to know more about heterogeneity by education or socioeconomic status. I think the trade-offs women are facing uh, should be very different by economic status. So low-income families and high-income families, and so the related to that, it seems like you're modeling the marriage and fertility as a choice of women make. But actually, I don't know how much the men contribute to that, to the trends we're facing. So I think this is related to the heterogeneity question, because the low educated men and or the men from lower family backgrounds, uh, they they should have very difficult time to forming families and marrying and having children as well. So I think you can be more balanced if you look at the man and women, and then also the if you look at heterogeneity by the economic status.
I agree. I mean, I think it goes to that figure that I showed you, men and women in South Korea, and you see the opposite pattern among men, that the less educated are, of course, less likely to be married. And that's like in any other developed countries, I guess. You know, you would expect that, right? If you have low earnings or if you don't have a job, it would be difficult to form families. And when it comes to the trade-off, yeah, I'm sure. So when you go to the lower social economic status, it may be more that, you know, it's not about their career. It's more like having, you know, being able to earn their living and having children at the same time. And I think one way to explain that is to differentiate the trend, the difference between these social economic groups and within a social economic group. So when you look at, for example, within a social economic group cell, you are definitely going to see lower marriage rates probably increasing for almost all groups, because as you said, economy is really difficult these days, and also housing prices are very high, youth unemployment rate is high. So you're going to say within each cell, you're going to see that more men, more women are probably not able to form families, especially in the lower end. But I think that itself is like a cohort trend within a cell. But what I think still also exists and is important is this difference with it between these cells. And the fact that I'm talking about is, you know, this very unique and interesting pattern where the highly educated, the women who have higher earnings, the women who should be more able to settle down, they're the ones who are not getting married and not having children. So to that, you need this extra mechanism of, you know, there being social norms or something that an extra barrier against this group. I think so. I think definitely there's this cohort trend, and also there is this thing that's going on between those two cells.
Okay, so we have many questions from the audiences. So let me try to deliver that to you one by one. So the first question is from Youngsun Kwon. So she was basically asking the question about whether the Korean women group who choose not to marry or not to have child, they were able to overcome the M-shaped labor force participation you mentioned.
So I guess if I plot the figure just for the never married group, yeah, then you're not gonna see that. I mean, if you're never married, you have to earn your own living, and they are gonna be working all through their age profile. And I think adding to that, I think interesting thing is in Korea, if I plot the labor force participation rate by education, or if I plot the labor force participation by marital status, you still see that the huge gap comes from marital status, not education. So in Korea, you see that when you're single and college graduate, single and less than college graduate, you know, you're gonna work. But if you're married, or if you have children, even if you're a grad student, even if you went to grad school, your labor force participation rate is going to be lower than that. So still, the important dimension comes in the family side, not from the education or human capital side in Korea.
Okay, that's very clear. So the next question is from Eric Lee. It's very fundamental, but at the same time, the important question. So his question is, why is family size important and why is low fertility alarming? He also has another question about any book recommendation, I mean, including your own publication on gender inequality or the fertility. So yeah, if you have any recommendations, please add that too.
Well, the first that's a very fundamental question, but yeah, I agree. It's a very important. Why should we worry? Seoul is very populated, very densely populated. Why not have some few people? I think low fertility is alarming in that we're not just talking about less people. We're talking about less younger people. I think that's the problem. I think having less people in general in Korea, I think we're fine with that. It's too crowded. But the problem is Korea is one of the oldest, it has one of the oldest population structure, meaning people live until they're in their 80s, 90s, and we have a huge population aging problem. But on top of that, now we are seeing tremendously low fertility rates, which means we're gonna automatically then have even accelerated population aging. And that is a problem, both for the society and the economy, because at least until now, the prime age the workers, they're the ones who pay the taxes, right? To be more specific, right? They pay the taxes to fund all the social security or welfare that the older people need. So if you have this tremendously low fertility rates, having population every generation, that's going to be a huge burden on the society and the government and the social security fund. So even if even if some people say, why not? We could have less people, but it's still alarming to have less younger people, less people who are going to be the pillars of the economy in Korea. I think that's what I'm and also other researchers are worried about when we talk about population structure. And book recommendations on gender inequality. Well, I guess you could start with, I mean, if you're interested in this topic, all my papers are on my website. And in the US, I mean, when you're talking about like textbook or more like a book instead of an academic paper, I would recommend that. Maybe this is biased, but from my advisor, Claudia Golden, she has she has great books on gender inequality in the US. So if you're interested in the US side of the story.
Great, Jisoo, that's not biased. I think the almost all economists are gonna agree with that. You should
Yeah,
start
her
from
work
the
is
Claudia
fantastic.
Goldin's book. So, and I also strongly recommend some of the students joining us today to check the Jisoo's the webpage. So she has the series of the very interesting the work on this, the women and the fertility, the labor force participation in Korea. Okay, so we have the next question is about the very interesting question about the role of media. I mean, I know that there are several academic papers looking at the effect of the 16 and pregnant, how that changes the fertility, the teen fertility in the US, and some Brazilian soap opera portraying the small family that changing the fertility in Brazil. So the question from the Laura Hoffman is, are we seeing any attempt at using the popular culture like K-dramas to encourage young women viewers to marry and have children?
That's a fun question. Actually, I think from also a fan of K-dramas, I think we're seeing the opposite, because because unless the government or some policymaker sets the agenda for K-dramas will try to appeal to young men and women. And what young men and women now, as I said, that's also my concern. Most of them are now thinking of family as an option. They don't need to be married. They don't need to have children. So I think most of the K-dramas actually now feature successful young career women, not bounded by family responsibilities and having their romantic relationships. I think that's the main, that's like the main trend these days. And I don't see many dramas trying to make balancing family and career, make that look beautiful, or to, trying to attempt to, encourage people to have children. I don't think we are seeing a lot of that. There's not a lot of, that's not very romantic, I guess. So you are actually seeing the opposite. You're seeing more young independent women being the main protagonist in the dramas.
That's very interesting. So then that may have contributed some of the low fertility rate.
Not gonna
Maybe
help.
that's too stretch. Okay, so the next question, so from the audience is that you mentioned that the Korean child rising expectations are different or higher than other countries. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Sure. So this is all relative, I guess, in the sense that even in the US, even in Sweden, I guess mothers take more than half the responsibility or more than half the burden of taking care of their children. But I think in Korea, it is more intense in the sense that, you can see the numbers, right? People drop out of the labor force. Um, Firstly, as I said, the workplace or schools or institutions in general do not assume this dual earner, dual caregiver model. So even if they don't have any bad intentions, a lot of burden ends up on the mother. And to give a few examples, I guess, school days are much shorter in Korea. So children in elementary school, they come home at 1 p.m., not 3 or 4. And so those kind of little institutional features, and also most of the parent meetings or when the teacher calls up, they always call on the mother. A lot of these behaviors, it's all based on the assumption that the mother is going to respond, that the mother is responsible for children. And even when the kids are old enough to go to college, usually if they go to a good college, they compliment the mother for having done a good job in managing the child's education. So it's not just about feeding the baby or breastfeeding. It's a really long-term uh, investment that they make, that the women make in their children in terms of time, effort, and energy, because a lot of that expectations, everyone expects the mother to not only be responsible when the child is a baby, but when the child, even for their college performance. So I think it is more intense in Korea in that sense.
Okay, great. The next question from the audience is from Unken Gakpak Unjungget. Sorry for my poor pronunciation. So the question is about the Goldmiss terminology. So even though that term is used to describe the career-focused women, it is discriminatory for sure. So the question is there any similar term for the men, and how the use of this term impacts the identities of the women who are career focused?
Mm. Um, I think in Korea, Goldmiss is now a really common term actually now. And it's it's like a spin to old miss, right? They made it gold miss because they're highly educated, they have careers and they have high pay. Um, the common, I think, in the media, when they try to refer to successful men, they use terms like alpha male. You hear the alpha type, but I'm not sure if that really captures the nuance that's happening in developed Asian countries, because the point here is that you see this gender asymmetry, right? Alpha male in Korea, they have both career and family. The alpha, I'm not sure if I can use that word, but that woman in Korea or other developed Asian countries, they only have career. So I think, I think using that term gold miss, or you would have to explain the nuance that goes on there. I think it's difficult to just use one-to-one the words that are used in the US or in Europe to explain what's going on here.
Okay, great. So for remaining the 5 minutes, so I will select the two questions and deliver that to you. So the second last question is from Jungmin Park. So he or she is say that the PhD student majoring in Korean history at the Seoul National University. Thank you for joining us today. So the wondering if there are very clear evidence of the statistical, there is very clear the evidence of the statistical tendency, but there are many scholars who don't believe that the gender gap represent the kind of the discrimination. So that could be some reflecting some productivity gap, or it could be any efficient outcome.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the opinion about the interpreting the statistical gap, and what is your opinion about the interpretation of that as a discrimination, and how do we make that kind of recognition gap the narrower? So that's basically the Jungmin's question.
I think it goes back to Stefan's question, actually, that when you have a very narrow definition of discrimination, you could say that there is no discrimination, or there's very little discrimination in the labor market if women are indeed taking care of children, and if they are indeed, spending more of their time and energy at non-work responsibilities. Then it may not be discrimination for the firm to not give important tasks and not give the promotion to women. But then I think when it comes to this topic, it's important then to go back a step and ask, then why are the women taking a larger share of the household responsibilities? Then you have to answer that question, right? That's not economic efficiency that resulted in that share. It's not that women are better at childcare or better at housework that we have this arrangement. This itself is a constraint that the society has put on the woman. So I think if you have a very narrow definition of discrimination, you will never get evidence for discrimination. But if you have a more general, more broader sense of discrimination, then there's a lot more to talk about. I think that's a one way to kind of when you argue or when you try to persuade other people about is there a gender discrimination in Korea, to first distinguish that.
That's so true. I completely agree with you that first of all, we should think about what is the definition of the discrimination, and upon that consensus, we can basically develop the discussion. That's very important point. So the last question we have is from Sujan Zhao. So what do you think is the most impactful policy or solution? Even though you mentioned a few of them, I want to basically readdress this question to you. And what is going to be the most impactful, the policy or the solution? Do you have any policy recommendation? So that's basically the last question we have to you today.
Okay. I think going to the last slide that I talked about, I think these gender neutral family policies, so to make workplace more family friendly, I think that is the direction to go. But then it could take time. It's this kind of issue, with regards to social norms or with regards to, households changing their arrangements and decisions. It's gonna take time. No policy, even the right policy, is not gonna give, impact. You're not gonna be able to see effects in just a few years. But I think despite that, we have to push along that direction, because that is the right direction to go to. And to give more specific examples, I guess, as I mentioned, not emphasize and make maternity leave longer, but to encourage both men and women to take parental leave, make that more open to both men and women, and really encourage that. And also, childcare facilities, preschools, make that, have workplace childcare facilities, or to have much more available, high quality public preschools. That could also help in the sense that you're kind of taking away that burden from the household to the society, right? You're not making either the wife or the husband take care of it, but the society take care of it. I think Korea is at a stage where the society or the government can take part in that responsibility, because we are already at a pretty alarming stage.
Okay, great. So I hope to see some improvement, in my home country, in the South Korea. So Jisoo, thank you for sharing your insight with us. It was very the interesting and active conversation between you panelists and the audiences. So we are gonna wrap up the webinar here today. As I advertised at the very beginning, so we are gonna have another webinar the next week and one in May. So I hope you join us. So even though it's a virtual, let's give a round of the applause to Jisoo for the great presentation and talk.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.